So I wrote a demand letter essentially to Zuckerberg, basically just being like, how dare you accuse us of being journalists? That's defamatory to our lack of character. You're gonna get the lawyer who advertises on the park bench next to our office to sue you. And just all these things being describing, we're satirists, we're miscreants, we're beguilers, we're tricksters, but we are not and never have been journalists. A couple days later, all of a sudden Facebook no longer blocked us. So I like to take credit for it, even though in my heart of hearts, I know it's probably just an algorithm tweak.
That is Luke Gordon-Field, editor-in-chief of the Canadian satirical news site The Beaverton, describing how they managed to stick handle around the Facebook ban on Canadian news organizations. As The Beaverton turns 15 years old, we're joined by Luke to talk about satire, comedy, and Canada on this episode of Explore, the Canadian Geographic podcast. Welcome to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. I'm your host, David McGuffin. Canada is rightfully famous for a lot of things, and especially in the last 50 years or so, that has come to include humor and comedy. Ryan Reynolds, Seth Rogen, Russell Peters, Catherine O'Hara, Jim Carrey, Samantha Bee, Lorne Michaels, Norm Macdonald, Dan Aykroyd, shows like Kim's Convenience, Schitt's Creek, Trailer Park Boys, the list goes on and on and on. Since 2010, The Beaverton has been woven firmly into that mix, providing daily news-driven chuckles into our social media channels and from its website. There was also a popular Beaverton TV series and a recently revived podcast. I follow it on Instagram, and here's just a few viral Beaverton headlines that made me laugh over the past few weeks. Canada counters American annexation with reminder it already belongs to elderly king. Or if you prefer hockey humor, Leafs jersey thrown onto ice gets by Toronto's defense and into back of their net. Or politics, conservative man discovers secret trick to getting elected prime minister, running as a liberal. Lord knows we all need to laugh, especially now in these troubling times. So let's get to Luke Gordon-Field and the hilarious history of the Beaverton. Luke Gordon-Field, welcome to the Explore podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great to have you. You are definitely part of my daily life. I follow you guys on Instagram, and you bring many well-timed chuckles into my day. So
that's the goal. That's the goal.
So 15 years, we can start there. I mean, congratulations. I know what it's like working in the digital space in Canada. I know that's probably been a challenge for you at times. Like, how is 15 years? How have you made it to this far?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some peaks and valleys, that's for sure. To a certain degree, it's all about what you expect of it. Because when we started, for the first 5 years, this was a silly little lark we were doing on the side. And this all started with a guy named Laurent Noonan, who had the idea and obviously was a huge fan of The Onion in the States and wanted to bring that kind of comedy here. And so he basically started it and had a website up because he knew how to do websites and stuff, but he didn't really, he wrote, but he didn't really have a team of writers, and I was in the comedy space. And so I joined up almost immediately, and no one was reading it. It was friends, it was family, it was, we would meet every Sunday at a bar behind Honest Ed's in Toronto. And, we would pitch headlines to make each other laugh with no thinking that anyone would ever read it. And it was just a complete side project, side hustle with no money. And all of a sudden in 2013, 14, people started to notice us. We got a little bit popular.
What was the turning point?
Yeah, the turning point, it's burned in stone at this point, where it was we published an article when Chris Hadfield was coming back from space about him because he was tweeting and posting videos the whole time. And so we thought we were making a silly little joke about he came back to a huge Rogers roaming bill, roaming. But also just a little joke about Rogers bills and how much Canadians pay for cell phones in our country. And I think Canadians for the most part got it and thought it was funny, but then it broke the kind of barrier of what was known, and so many people around the world and in Canada, millions of people were reading it thinking it was real.
Yeah.
And so we had interviews with requests from websites that we never heard of that were and we thought it was a fun thing. And then they were hey, this is bad. Why did you do this? Why did you lie and slander Chris Hadfield? We're oh no, it was a joke. And we heard from Chris's kind of people that for years afterwards, whenever he would go, especially internationally at a book signing or anything, someone would inevitably come up to him and be like, hey, so sorry about that phone bill. And so we made his life a little bit worse for a couple of years there, which we did not mean to do. But so that was definitely the turning point where we went from a complete unknown entity to something that people had at least heard of. Not to say we went to a huge following overnight, but it became a thing where it started to feel a bit real. And then the next 2 years, we kind of built on that. But again, it was just, there was no money. We were just doing it for fun. No one got paid or anything. And whatever ad money we made, we would use on a Christmas party at the end of the year and get the writers some beer and pizza, like that's the
Yeah,
level we
yeah.
were talking about.
So you're
And
doing
then,
what, stand-up at the time? What's paying your bills?
yeah, no, I was doing stand-up, but I certainly won't pretend stand-up was paying my bills. But I've always had, until the show premiered, I was working as a lawyer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so I got into this because I was running the student newspaper up at Osgood, not the prestigious law review, but the little silly student newspaper that like usually just reported on like campus events and stuff. But I like just turned as an excuse as okay, it's 2 a.m. and I don't want to study for my contracts law exam. So what if I just wrote a silly article for the student newspaper, and that'll activate a different part of my brain that isn't completely bored with all this. So that's how I got into this kind of writing and newspaper style writing, and found my way towards the Beaverton eventually. So yeah, so I was working as a lawyer this whole time, just doing this completely on the side. Like there was many times I would be at a discovery or something, and I would like during a break or whatever, quickly post an article on Facebook or whatever. So it was, it was an interesting time where there was a lot of worlds colliding, and I was trying to keep them separate.
Yeah. They do say you can do anything with a law degree, and I guess you're actually
Yeah.
I proof of that.
Yeah, I'm not sure it helped at all, but I have a law degree and I do this, and those are two true statements.
Yeah. So I worked in Washington for a long time
It,
at National Public Radio and the morning show. And we did these little segments. This is like 10, 12 years ago. Little funny news segments. And I actually had to put an email out to our all staff saying the Beaverton is not an actual newspaper.
really?
Totally.
Oh, that's great.
Because at least twice they got on air, right? Yeah.
Oh, I would love to know what it was. I assume it was something like really like that any Canadian would be like, that's suspicious, but an American just wouldn't know kind of thing or something
Yeah,
like
no,
that. Yeah.
exactly. And I wish I could remember too, but it was just long. But I remember literally having to write Beaverton X. It's like-
Please stop quoting this
These-
clearly ridiculous. And also, that's such an American thing to not immediately hear the word Beaverton and think
No,
that sounds
totally.
fake. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
yeah. They definitely call their real newspapers the Beaverton up in Canada.
So yeah, well, let's talk about the name. Where did the name? I mean, obviously Beaver in Canada, but
You know what? I wish I had an answer for you. Laurent
Yeah.
named it, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, he's no longer with us.
Sorry.
And I never thought to ask. And I wish I knew what his inspiration was. I have no idea if it was just he had been to Beaverton, Ontario. I thought that was a funny name. Or he took the name of our national anthem, excuse me, and added ton to it. I have truly no idea. I do know that maybe, and this might be the kind of answer to your question, but we won't know for sure, is he did, when he started the Beaverton, get the idea, and maybe this came first and then the name came afterwards, to get this kind of like ridiculous beaver tuxedo costume that he would wear, and he would like walk around Toronto, because we used to have physical copies of the paper, and he would hand out the paper to get some buzz going for it. And obviously, you're walking around Yonge and Dundas Square or something, you see a guy in a beaver suit handing out papers. You're like, maybe I don't want a paper, but I kind of want to see what's going on over here. So he certainly got some very initial eyeballs that way. Honestly, the name might have come from what animal he thought would be the funniest to put in a tuxedo. It could be that. I don't know.
So we're just coming out of an election, which
It
is
is.
that's got to be so rich for you guys material wise, right? And how is this election? I mean, you've covered a bunch now.
It's true. Yeah, I would say this election, obviously, it had so much more of a roller coaster vibe to it, because it was for a year leading into it, year plus. We knew what this election was going to be. It's going to be Liberals get wiped out, and we have a new government, and that's going to be a complete game changer, because he is, if nothing else, very different than the people who come before him. And Poilievre is going to be very different than Trudeau, and everyone knew what this election was going to be. And then obviously Trudeau stepping down / getting not so subtly forced out, and then the Liberal leadership race in Carney, and then Trump was, so that's game changer one, and then Trump is obviously game changer two. And the tariffs we expected, but the 51st state stuff was so out of the blue. And yeah, so it was definitely the most exciting race to cover that we've covered, because even in 2015, which we were around for, but again, very early days, it was a big moment, because obviously we're changing governments, which is more exciting than a government winning. But it didn't feel anywhere near this exciting in terms of day-to-day stories to cover, like what was going on with how U.S. news was and Trump being such an insane figure was impacting our daily life in a way that even in his first term, he didn't do as much of. So
Yeah.
there was just so much to cover, and it felt like one of those times where it is hard to keep up with the news, just because I think what happened, and it felt, okay, that's clearly the biggest story of the day. Let's write about it and come up with our take on it. And then while we're editing that and getting that all ready for the world, a bigger story would drop, and we're like, shoot, now we got to jump over here, which is exciting and obviously somewhat frustrating, because you're like, oh, right, that thing we thought was perfect. I guess we could still put it up, but no one's going to read it, or very few people will read it because now everyone's over here talking about this other thing. So yeah, it was fun and frenetic, and I'm a little sad it's over and also a little excited to sleep.
Yeah, I bet. Can I just add some great headlines? I just want to read through some of them.
Oh, thank you.
Polyev rushed to safety after actual journalist question makes it past security. And the picture too, because we
Yeah,
can't
it's
show the
for
picture.
those who haven't seen it, it's the Photoshop of Trump after the attempted shooting with all
Yeah,
security
yeah,
around him, but Poilievre's face obviously
yeah, fist in the
photoshopped onto
air.
his
Yeah.
head. Yeah.
Which is just great and just speaks to a larger truth, obviously. And Mark Carney, so interesting figure, right? But he's not just a banker; he's actually a central banker, which could potentially make him the most boring person in the world.
Yeah, you might be right there. Yeah, that might be a bit of a to go from everything's exciting, oh my God, to trying to make jokes out of Mark Carney just being like, if you look at the fiscal stimulus for first quarter earnings, and you're like, oh my God. So yeah, that might be we might have to find some different ground to focus on, maybe a little less politics for a while. But yeah, he's the other thing too is he's such an unknown entity for him to be an elected now prime minister when all we really know is banker, not Trudeau, not Polyev. Like, those are basically the three things we know about him, and I guess we're slowly learning that he likes punk rock, and based on his interview with the Nardwuar, really. But other than that, it's like, he's a human man with a face, and he wears a suit, and, like, we're gonna discover who he is as he's leading our country for the next, potentially, 4 years, so it's good. That is fascinating, but I think his personality will definitely give us less content than like Trudeau or Poilievre's personalities did and do, because he just doesn't have that same kind of, he can make news just with an appearance the way either of those guys could do, especially Trudeau in the early days could do. He would just do something quirky and goofy and the internet would lose its mind back when the internet loved him, and and we could make fun of that. And I don't see Carney planking or appearing behind photobombing a family in a cave somewhere, whatever that story was with Trudeau back in the day. Yeah, I don't think Carney's going to give us that same level of daily content.
No. My favorite Carney headline: Mark Carney questions why struggling young Canadians not setting up offshore tax havens. I thought that was.
Yeah. Just the he means well, but he's blissfully unaware that not everyone can do what he does things. So yeah, there's definitely that attitude of, and I think anyone who's just got a certain level of financial expertise and especially money is just unaware of, I think, the financial situation of so many people. And it's just, what do you mean you haven't maxed out your RSPs and maxed out your TFSAs and done and bought 3 investment properties? And
I have to say though, when he did the Jon Stewart Daily Show interview, I really didn't know much about him, and I watched that, and I was like, hey, he's actually got a very good dry sense of humor.
you know what? I will give him that props. And his election night speech too, as exhausted as I was trying to stay awake for it at 2 a.m. or whatever, the first 20 minutes, he's just riffing with the crowd and like making little asides and jokes. And it wasn't called yet, but it very much looked like Poilievre was going to lose his seat. And so someone shouts out, I think it's Bruce is the first name of the guy who beat him. And he's like, Bruce, and he's like, I'm looking forward to working with him. And then the crowd goes nuts. Like, it is a little bit like, I'm sure he was like the funniest guy at Goldman, which maybe isn't the funniest guy in the world, but
clear
better than nothing.
that bar. Yeah, totally. Another Poilievre headline here: Poilievre vows to stay on as party leader for reasons of being otherwise unemployable. That's golden.
Yeah,
Who wrote that?
Hey,
Who gets credit for that one?
yeah, that is, I believe that's Ian McIntyre, but I would have to double check. Ian's one of our senior editors and is a brilliant writer. It's a very relatable one too, because it's, hey, sometimes you're in an industry so long, and it's, if that all of a sudden you lose your job and you're like, hey, I can't do anything else. And it's like, now I can kind of relate to Poilievre. He's been an MP for so long. It's like, obviously by virtue of his position, he would probably be able to get a consultant or one of those like boardroom gigs. So obviously it's not real. There is something to, hey, you've been doing something for 20 years and now you got to do something else. And it's like, I don't have any other skills.
Only one thing on the resume, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I want to tick through a couple more of your headlines from the past,
Sure.
too, because there's some dandies. Parrot removed from Montreal Biodome after learning too much English.
Yeah, that one was again really instrumental in getting us known by the world. That's going back quite a bit. I believe that was a Laurent headline, at least. He might not have written the article, but I believe that was his headline. It was one that he pitched and we all immediately loved and thought, clearly ridiculous, clearly over the top. We're satirizing a real thing, of course. Quebec, the language laws, the language police, that was a big story at the time, et cetera, et cetera. But it was something that, like, again, so many people thought was real, and we were like, "No, why do you think this is real?" But I guess it just was, like, not knowing Quebec as well as others, maybe it was a little too close to the bone, but in a fun way, obviously. But, yeah, it was that one. I loved that headline. From the second LeBron pitched it, I was like, 100% yes, write that as soon as possible, please.
And you guys, you had a TV show for 3 years, right? And that, I mean, the opening episode was about the election of Donald Trump, and I just rewatched it, and you could almost run it now.
Tonight on the Beaverton, Donald J. Trump has been elected president. Is this America's 9/11?
We finally have an answer to the question of whether the U.S. is more racist or sexist.
With Trump's victory, Hillary Clinton now makes an important decision: which prison gang to join.
Yeah, I know, especially because the day after he was reelected or elected again, I guess is the term. Yeah, that was so fun because it was such a challenge because we pitched Bell Media on, essentially what the show ended up being by season 3, which was topical, a look at the news through our lens, but as opposed to like The Daily Show or what 22 does, instead of like directly commenting on the real news, it's going to be more like through the Beaverton lens of making stuff up. But obviously you're talking about the real news story, et cetera, et cetera. And that was the show they wanted and the show we all wanted to make. But in season 1, that was when like 4K was just coming online. And Bell had made some kind of, I don't know, complete commitment to everything airing in 4K. And so as we're kind of writing season 1, they come to us and say, hey, it has to air in 4K, and the rendering time on 4K is like weeks.
What? Oh.
Yeah. So you have to shoot your stuff weeks before it airs. And we were like, that's a different show than the show you bought, but it's one of those things where it's like, it can be this or it can be no show. And we were like, well, I guess we take this. And then almost simultaneously, they were like, also you air the day after the election. And we were like, the US election. We were like, okay, so we won't know who wins. So we wrote 3 different versions, right? We wrote Hillary, we don't know, and Trump. And so we thought at the time when we were writing, again, we were writing this 3-4 weeks of advance, Hillary was so far ahead in the polls, it was unbelievable. So we spent days carefully sculpting the Hillary wins version. And obviously the plan was we would have a 7 or 8 minute intro or 6 or 7 minute, whatever what ended up being. And then they would all meet at an edit point, and then the rest of the episode would unfold the same. We didn't write 3 completely different episodes. We wrote 3 different openings that all had to be the same time. They all had to come in at almost exactly the same to the second time, so that at the edit point, when we threw to like a field piece or whatever, we were locked in the episode. So you didn't have to edit 3 completely different episodes. Anyways, not to get too in the weeds of it, but yeah, so we carefully scripted the Hillary stuff. I remember spending just days, like every word. And then I think we dashed off the Trump stuff in 2 hours. We were like, this will be fun for when we release it online as a like sliding doors, imagine if kind of thing. And then when we recorded it in front of an audience. And so when we recorded it, everything did well, but the Trump stuff really killed. And again, because we were in that kind of spot of everyone was like, yeah, this will never happen. And also, they were good jokes. And yeah, so and then the night of the election, we're all like, okay, let's put the Hillary stuff online as soon as they call it for. And then all of a sudden it's 2 a.m. and you're like, I think we're putting the other thing online and everyone get ready. And I was so worried the person who like literally programs the switchboard at CTV or Bell Media would put in the wrong version and we would air. We would start our first episode with a massive F up where it's Hillary wins. And so it was just chaos. And then we're down doing a bunch of press to promote the show, and the Trump wins version is going online, and I'm in green rooms and stuff, drinking coffee, trying to stay awake. And like, I look at my phone, I'm like, oh man, this is blowing up. That's still one of the biggest pieces of content we've ever put out. And obviously the biggest video content, like it was like front of Reddit and all this stuff. And we were like, oh wow, this is great for us, terrible for the world, but great for us.
I remember listening to an interview with Armando Iannucci, the guy, the showrunner of Veep, and just him talking about why he left midway through, like after season 2, I think. And I think part of it was that the politics were getting so bizarre in real life that he felt he couldn't compete anymore. And that's obviously a challenge for you guys too, right?
Oh yeah. How do you out absurd the absurd? It's a daily challenge for sure. And the tricky thing, Veep was such a brilliant show, but yeah, so much, it's almost reached Simpsons level of so much of what they did has come true. And obviously that show was nonpartisan in the sense they were making fun of the process, and they never really defined who was who, although towards the end it was pretty clear Selena was supposed to be a Democrat. And we have a similar thing where things we think are ridiculous 4 or 5 years ago, all of a sudden 4 or 5 years later, we're like, our article came true. That's not good. We don't want that. Like, you know what I mean? Because it's never like, oh, this fun thing that we wanted to happen. You know what I mean? It's always, can you imagine this horrible thing happening? And then 4 or 5 years later, it really does happen. And we're like, nuts. That's not what we were going for. So yeah, there's definitely an element of that. And it's a daily challenge. It's a thing I think about all the time. It's just like, how do we outdo the world in a way that we won't look back on and be like, oh, we were just pointing at a thing and saying, look how bad that is, or look how crazy that is. So that's the challenge with political comedy right now, is like, so much of the worst of political comedy can just be like, can you believe this? And it's like, you want to do more than that, right? You want to have something to say beyond just, we all agree this is bad or silly or crazy or whatever. We want to have something to actually say about it. So that's the challenge for sure. And it's something I have some sleepless nights thinking about.
Yeah, yeah. So you guys, do you have daily editorial meetings and that kind of thing? Is that how?
No, we have essentially, so we're decentralized in the sense that we have a team of 5 to 6 editors, and at any given point, and they each kind of either collectively or either in tandem or individually have like writers who they supervise. And so basically, like, every editor has their own like meeting that they supervise the pitch meetings for. So like for non-topical stuff, of course. So like for stuff that is either not like super timely or is like evergreen, they just have writers who pitch to them at a weekly meeting. And then, so like writers will come in with like 10 to 20 headlines, and the editor will usually approve like 1 or maybe 2 on a really good week. So it's a low success rate, obviously. If it's something that isn't timely, the writer can go off and write it and bring it back for the next week's meeting. And then all the writers kind of pitch and like pitch jokes and say, actually, that joke doesn't work, or you're off game here, whatever the note would be. And the editor and then the writer take it away and finalize it. And the editor posts it. We have like a schedule, obviously, of posting slots, and the editor does it that way. And then for topical stuff, we just all have, so that's usually over Zoom or Google Meet. And then for topical stuff, we just have, as silly as it sounds, we just have a writer's Facebook group where people are constantly pitching stuff. And then you can vote on it by just liking it. So as much as we are trying to find a system that works better than Facebook, the difficulty is it's such a brutally simple method that it does work for us. And then every once in a while, the editors and I, because we're all in different cities, really, the editors and I will all meet together and have like strategy meetings, long-term kind of things. Or sometimes we do like calls for submissions for new writers. So we'll meet to review those kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a pretty remote world that we live in now. We used to meet in person, and like I said, we used to meet at that pub, and after that we met in an office building where we did all our like digital content stuff, and then COVID took away all that. and so now we're all just fully virtual, but every once in a while we get together for drinks or something.
For you, what's a sweet spot like in terms of a story? Like, what are you looking for?
Ooh, there's 2 answers. There's 2 categories. From a like artistic perspective of what just makes the best headline, and then what will do the best online, because they're not always the same. So obviously doing the best online depends a lot on being timely. There's very few like super evergreen headlines do as well as our topical takes on like the election, for example. So like timely is very important. So and also it's a double-edged sword, because it's very important, but if you're late, as I was talking about before, if you're writing a joke about a story that people are no longer passionate about or talking about, that it just feels, what are we doing here? You would have been better off doing something that wasn't an attempt at topical, because being 2 days late on a topical story the world might like just looks at you and shrugs and is like, oh yeah, I remember that. Anyways, moving on. So timely is very key for views. From a artistic perspective, the things that I look for the most in a headline is like a really strong point of view, like something that really even though you're lying, you're making something up in the artifice of our headlines, something that really clearly communicates where you're at, how you're seeing the world. And so that's something that people who see the world a similar way can really jump onto and hold on to, and will appeal to them. And then brevity, so being as concise with your words as possible, so people don't need to read a whole paragraph just to get the joke. The dream for me with every headline I write is that it be 2 words long. And I fail almost every time. But that's the dream, is if I can somehow condense my joke down to 2 words, then I'm a very happy guy. And
What's your best example of that?
Well, I'll steal the audience for that one, but the best one that I love, and it probably doesn't work out of context, but it made me laugh so hard, is just during the one of the Olympics, I forget which one, when Michael Phelps was winning every race, every swimming gold, he was winning them all, is just in the middle of all that, they just had a headline that just says Phelps drowns. And I don't know why, but that made me laugh so hard, because it's obviously just like such a joke about that he's winning everything and he's the best swimmer ever and he's got a body that was like, he's half dolphin or whatever. And it was just like, so just to have a headline that just says Phelps drowns with no other details, I thought was the funniest. This is like, maybe I was writing satire at this time, or maybe this was just before the Beaverton. I could be wrong, but it just made me howl with
Yeah.
laughter.
No, that's perfect. That's absolutely perfect. You mentioned Facebook a bit ago. I mean, Facebook actually, you got swept up in the whole Facebook media, like they shut down Canadian media basically and continuing to shut down most media
Yes.
over government legislation. And so how did you extract yourself from that?
Yeah, well, we were kind of laughing about it, and before, when they were threatening to do it, we were like, maybe we wrote an article about we will be the ultimate arbiters of the truth because there will be nothing else. And like, we were having a lot of fun with it, but there was a little tiny concern in my brain that I was like, we call ourselves North America's trusted source of news. We're news kind of all over the website and stuff. I know Facebook's not going to go have someone going through and website by website being like news, not news, news, not news. It's going to be an algorithm. And I was like, I wonder if there was a 10% of me that was like, I wonder if we're going to get caught up in this. And then I was like, probably not. And then I just moved on. And then, so when the ban came in place and we were starting to get messages from people being like, we would share an article on Facebook and we'd get comments and messages from people being like, Facebook's telling me I can't see this. Facebook's telling me I can't see this. All of a sudden, that little tiny concern in my brain was like, no, because as much as we make fun of it, Facebook has been so instrumental to our development as a website. There was a time throughout the 2010s where Facebook was probably 80% of our traffic. Now, that's not true anymore, but it's still hugely important. There was the immediate business concern of how do we pay our bills without this traffic coming to us and all that stuff. So I was like, I wanted to solve this problem for real, but I also want to have fun with it. So what we did was I wrote and again, I'm a lawyer, so I wrote a like demand letter essentially to Zuckerberg that obviously we never actually sent, but we posted all over social media and I knew it would get past Facebook censors because it wasn't a link to our website. It was just a photo. And we posted a demand letter to Zuckerberg, basically just being like, how dare you accuse us of being journalists? That's defamatory to our lack of character. And we're going to sue you. We're going to get the lawyer who advertises on the park bench next to our office to sue you. And just all these things being like describing, we're satirists, we're miscreants, we're beguilers, we're tricksters, but we are not and never have been journalists. And really just treating like journalism as if it was like a dirty word that like to taint us with that brush is how horrible of you. And anyways, that went mega viral, which was wonderful and great that everyone got the joke and had a lot of fun with it. And I have no idea if it had anything to do with that. In fact, I would bet probably a lot of money that it had nothing to do with that and probably just an algorithm change. But a couple of days later, all of a sudden, Facebook no longer blocked us. So I like to take credit for it, even though in my heart of hearts, I know it was probably just an algorithm tweak. But in my mind, Zuckerberg saw our demand letter and cowered and ran for the woods and was terrified of our legal threat.
That's awesome. You should take credit for that.
Oh,
I think that. Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, you talk about your funding model there a bit too, right? Like, obviously, the advertising is part of it and social media is a big part of that. I'm going to take notes here, but how do you make it work?
I would love to say we have some kind of plan. We were very much from a financial perspective. We've never had any idea what we were doing. I'll be honest. And I say that because that's technically my job. I'm the president of the company or whatever, to the extent it's a company. But so that was always my job. And so like the first 5-6 years, there was just no money. We were just doing it for fun, beer and pizza money at the end of the year, at the Christmas party, that kind of thing. And then when the show got picked up, very wonderfully as part of, again, not to get in the way Canadian production works is it's all through funding mechanisms like the Bell Media Fund and stuff like that, which is separate from Bell Media, the company, and the Independent Production Fund, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the requirements at the time, and still is, I believe, is that every like new show has to have a digital component in order to get tap into this funding, which was perfect for us because obviously we were already a digital.
That's all
component.
you're doing on that.
So instead of creating something new like a web series or a series of shorts or behind the scenes videos that no one would really care about, essentially we were able to use that money to fund the website. So through the show, which was amazing and huge. So all of a sudden we were able to pay. Obviously, the writers who worked on the show were getting paid like Writers Guild rates, but even just writing the website, it went from we pay you nothing to we pay you per article, which is still our model. We pay everyone's freelance. We just pay per article. And it was amazing and wonderful. And it was money that was coming. The show producers were just able to funnel it to us and the writers would get paid. And it was wonderful. And then, of course, the show gets canceled, and like we had a little bit of left over, and we stretched that out as thin as it could. And our production company was wonderful in helping us find a little bit of extra money that we were able to stretch for as long as we could. And essentially, we just stretched that and stretched that. And of course, we had advertising, and we started a merch store, and we started teaching workshop classes and all these things to keep the lights on and keep paying our writers. And then by spring, summer of last year, so almost a year ago now, I was looking at the numbers and I was like, we're done. We can't keep going. It's just a situation where we've stretched the money as far as we can. And even though our traffic is way up from where it was when the show got picked up, ad rates have just plummeted so much that for more traffic than we were getting in 2016, 17, now we're making a third as much, a fourth as much. And merch is great, but that's not going to pay for all the writing. And so we either need to shut down completely or basically like publish way fewer articles, or just go back to everyone does this for free model, which I would hate to do, because once you start paying people, it feels terrible to ask them to work for free. And the world is different, right? We're not all 23 and just meeting up at a bar, and we're in our 30s and people have bills, and it was no one's full-time job, but people were putting a lot of effort to it. Asking them to do it for free was just never really an option. In a desperation move, we were just like, well, let's try Patreon and see if we can reach out to our fans, to our readers, and see if any of them would be willing to kick in a few bucks a month to keep us going. And I remember talking to the editors and being like, I would say it's like a 20-30% chance that this succeeds and 70% chance that it doesn't. But it's a Hail Mary, and let's try it. And we got a way bigger response than I was expecting. Like,
Oh, wow.
people signed up at rates that I just was shocked about, and really not only got us to a point where we can keep going, but got us to the point where we just were able to announce a couple months ago that we were paying our writers more per article, that we've increased their rates, that we brought back the podcast, which we couldn't afford to do, that was dormant for quite a while, and that we wanted to bring back but couldn't afford to do. And, and we were able to pay the panelists to appear on that. So yeah, it was a complete game changer. I don't know that there's any business plan to that other than just get lucky, but that's what we did. And we're just extremely grateful to the people who signed up for supporting us, and the fact that they signed up. And the concern is, okay, we'll make all these plans based on the signups, and then a month or two later, everyone cancels, and you're like, oh no. But they've stuck around, which has been amazing.
Yeah. So it's like a monthly thing,
Yeah.
basically. Yeah.
Basically, it's just like we have a subscription model where it's like you can give more, but like at $4 a month, you can give us like $4 a month, and there's like some perks. You get like exclusive articles. You get the podcast that we do. There's a regular version and the Patreon kind of extended cut. So you get 20 more minutes or 15 more minutes of content every week on the podcast, where we talk about news stories that, like this week with the election, obviously we talked about the election the whole time. And so we covered the liberals and the conservatives on the regular podcast, and we dove into the whole situation with the NDP and the Greens on the Patreon exclusive. So if you want to get sad about the state of NDP, you got to give us $4. But yeah, it's not always that bad. And then at higher levels, you get more perks and stuff. But it was just one of those things that we threw it out there. And we had seen, obviously, with friends of ours who have podcasts or have YouTube channels, we'd seen it work with them, but I just wasn't sure if it would really work for a website. And so far, we're 7 or 8 months into it. It seems to be working.
Nice. Yeah. And the podcast, it's weekly, yeah?
Yeah, it comes out every Wednesday. Usually we record it Tuesday, so it's close to timely as we can get with the nature of having to edit and things like that. So we record Tuesday. It's a panel where I host, and I bring in 3 Beaverton comedians or writers to talk about the news of the week. So we go through all the topical stories, and then in the end, we play a little silly quiz where we joke about some of the lesser known news stories of the week, usually the silly or the absurd, and I challenge their knowledge of that. So that's more of the lighthearted side of things, because obviously the rest of the podcast can be talking about. Sometimes the topical news stories are quite heavy, shockingly, but we always want to have fun. So we always end with a little quiz called the approximately 10-minute long quiz, which usually comes in around 15 minutes. So I should really rename it the approximately 15-minute long quiz. But so yeah, so that's a fun thing we're doing. We've only brought that back. I think we just released our 6th episode. We were doing it back all the way back in 2018-19, and it was a lot of fun, but it was just not with the show. We just didn't have time to do it. And then the show got canceled. I was like, great, we'll go back to the podcast. And then COVID hit. And I was like, okay, we can't get 5 people in a room, and I can't go over to the studio and I didn't want to do it over Zoom. So I was like, okay, COVID will probably be over in a month or two. We'll get back to it then. And then years later, then we were broke, and then we couldn't afford to do it. Yeah. So as soon as the Patreon, we realized it was actually going to be successful, that was the first thing we wanted to expand into / bring back.
I mean, we all ingest American comedy up here, right? And obviously there's a lot of Canadians in that, but what is the main difference for you for creating comedy for a Canadian audience versus what American comedy is?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think my answer has changed over the years on that. I think my answer a few years ago would have been American political comedy, at least, is much more no holds barred, much more teeth, much more aggressive. There's not a undercurrent of respect. In Canada, traditionally, the satire, as goofy as it is, as much as they're willing to really do make fun of our politicians and always have on Air Farce, on 22, etc., there was a certain undercurrent of, at the end of the day, we're all on the same team. And I think that's changing. I don't think that's true really anymore with what we do, with what 22 Minutes does. I think it's a little bit more, and maybe that's because there's a lot of generations who grew up watching the American equivalents of like Daily Show and Colbert, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think now Canadian comedy is a little bit more in that American style of what, you're not on my team, and go F yourself. And if you've done something that genuinely I find horrifying, I'm not going to be afraid to call you out, and not necessarily in a silly, goofy way. Now, I think there's still elements of that for sure in Canada. Like 22 will still have politicians on and do fun games with them and things like that. And I get that. So that I think is changing, but maybe hasn't changed is my short answer. Whereas I think American shows, like there's no love lost. There's just no like sense of like, well, at the end of the day, we'll go and get a beer and we'll laugh about this.
Yeah.
That I think there still is an element of in Canada, although I do think it's changing.
So you started out in stand-up? You did, is that something you
Yeah.
still do? Or?
I mean, it started out, I haven't done stand-up in many years, but yeah, I did. That's how I was first introduced to the comedy community. And through that met Laurent. He was never a stand-up, but he knew a lot of comedians, and a lot of comedians obviously also do like comedy writing for TV shows and stuff, or comedy writing for various entities.
So I'm always curious though about stand-ups and musicians too, because you get to see a version of Canada, I think, that isn't necessarily what a lot of other people see.
Yeah, certainly a more inebriated version. But I was never at the stage where I was like touring all over the country. So I was what they call a middle. So basically, like you're in order of seniority. It's like opener, middle, MC, headliner, right? So the MC is obviously the second most important because they start the whole show. Although it's hilarious, so many times people will come up to an MC and be like, "You should do comedy," and they're like, "I just did." 20 minutes off the top, 5 minutes in between each act. But for some reason, they think the MC is a comedian. Anyways, that's not important. But yeah, so I was a middle. So the most I ever did was tour. I would tour, like, I did a bit in the East Coast. Then I would do like a rotation of Toronto, Kingston, Ottawa. There was a series of clubs called Absolute. I don't think they have the Kingston one anymore. But so you would do 3 weeks in a row. You'd go from like, yeah, Toronto, where I'm from, obviously, and where I live. So it's like, that was easy. Just go home at the end of the night. And then Kingston, Ottawa, you're staying in like the comedy condos and stuff. So you definitely you get to experience a certain amount of like just having free time in a city that isn't yours, and isn't necessarily like, I'm going to go do the tourist stuff, but I'm just going to walk around. I don't know Ottawa super well. I've never spent a ton of time in it. I would just walk around during the day and just get a sense of the city. And that is something that's rare to get to do, because usually if you're visiting a city, you're either visiting friends or family, or it's, I'm going to hit the 5, what this guidebook says to do or whatever. Just being like someone who's just in a city for a week, telling jokes at night, often having some drinks at night, and then spending your days doing whatever, just having idle days is a really rare thing that obviously in our very busy lives, very few times people I think have idle time. And so, yeah, so it was definitely obviously going in the summer was a little bit better than in the winter, when I would usually just try and stay Kingston in the winter. I'd like, I'll just stay in the condo and watch TV. That's fine. But, I remember having like a lot of interesting times walking around like Kingston's waterfront, and Ottawa's, walking all the way through Ottawa up to the War Museum and down the hill and stuff, and down to the hill. And yeah, so it was a fascinating time. And then obviously at night you get a sense of obviously what people respond to comedically, but then in the bar afterwards, you get a lot of different characters coming up to you and talking to you about whatever they wanted to talk to you about. And sometimes those were interesting things. Sometimes those were full-on conspiracy theories. And sometimes they were just interesting slices of life. That was fun too. Anyway, sorry, very long answer to your question.
No, not at all. In terms of an audience that you liked going back to, what would that be?
Oh, yeah. Absolute audiences, like the Absolute Comedy Clubs, were always great. They were usually like revved to the max. So the tricky thing was like, okay, is this a funny joke, or is it just like they're so happy to be partying on a Saturday night that I could say pretty much anything and get a response? So that was always the trick with Absolute. When I wasn't touring, which again I didn't do a ton of, my go-to spot was Comedy Bar in Toronto, which is at like Bloor and Ossington area. So that is, I think, still my favorite club in the city. Now there's one on Danforth, which is near me. So I still like, even though I'm not doing stand-up as much anymore, I'll still go see shows there from time to time. So like for me, those shows were great because it was definitely like, it was an audience that was excited to see stand-up, and they would respond, but they weren't easy. They would usually be very discerning of what they liked. And yeah, there was a little bit of, it's a bit of a Toronto hipster crowd, so you could make the argument that some jokes that would do well there maybe don't play to a crowd that isn't covered in tattoos and on their way with their fixed gear bike and stuff. So I get that, but it was always my favorite space. It was also where all the comedians would hang out. So for example, like so much of the comics that ended up working on the Beaverton, I met through hanging out at Comedy Bar, and you would be like, "Hey, you're funny. You've ever tried writing satirical news headlines? Let me know." So things like that. It was and still is, I'm just not really part of it anymore, a great community space. It was just a hub of comedy in Toronto for a few years.
All right. I usually end up these interviews with a question that asks for a favorite place in Canada, but is there a funniest place in Canada?
Oh, yeah. I spent a weekend in St. John's, Newfoundland, and that is probably my answer because, and I hope this is insulting. It's so wonderfully lived up to the stereotype, which I just mean everyone was loud and charming, and yeah, okay, had a few, and there was music everywhere, and I had this moment where, so my wife and I were, at the time girlfriend, but now wife, we had done a road trip out to the east, and this is right after we graduated law school. So we'd done a road trip from Toronto all the way out to St. John's, and obviously we took the ferry out to St. John's, and she was flying back because she had to start work earlier than I did, and I was going to drive the car back. So we're at a bar, and she's having a couple of drinks, but I'm not really drinking. I think I had a Diet Pepsi or whatever. And so everyone at the bar is like, "What are you doing? Why aren't you drinking?" And I was like, "Oh, because I got to drive her to the airport in an hour or whatever, an hour and a half." And it was a nighttime flight. And every single person at the bar was like, "Oh, I'll drive her. I'll drive you guys." So wonderfully living up to the stereotypes of we'll do anything for a stranger, because we had never met these people. We were just hanging out at the same bar in like Kitty Vidi outside St. John's. And which was so sweet, but also like they were so drunk. Like, I will never take you up on this.
Yeah.
I was like, "No, that would just be you driving while intoxicated," which is the thing I'm trying to avoid.
Luke, wouldn't lose your license though.
Yeah.
In that DUI pullover.
Yeah, 100%. So I was delighted, and also I was joking with them about that because, of course, I'm a comedian too. So I was like immediately, "You're hammered. What are you doing?" And like making fun of them. But yeah, anyway, so we had a truly wonderful weekend there. And it's been a decade plus now, so this is maybe completed stereotypes, but my short answer would be St. John's, Newfoundland.
Awesome. Listen, congratulations on 15 years of the Beaverton, and perseverance, that sounds, is the key.
Yeah, perseverance, a lot of luck, and some Chris Hadfield articles.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed this, please give us a rating and review where you listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes. An excerpt of this interview will also appear in an upcoming issue of Canadian Geographic magazine, which is Canada's largest paid circulation magazine. You can get your subscription for just $28.50 a year. Such a great value for award-winning work. And that gets you 6 issues delivered to your house and unlimited digital access. Go to cangeo.ca/subscribe to sign up. You'll be very happy that you did. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June the 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
We flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.
I guess 160 dives or so. There are shrimp swimming around outside. It's just fabulous.